Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today I'm joined by Wendy Corsi Staub, the New York Times bestselling author of more than 90 novels, the most recent of which is The Butcher's Daughter. Wendy and I happen to have a bit of a history. Hers was my very first book signing way back in 2006, and we've been friends ever since. Funny, she hasn't appeared to age between then and now. I wish I could say the same, but I can't, and I digress. Wendy is best known for her psychological suspense novels, and while her first books in the genre were standalone titles that featured villains hiding behind familiar faces, her more recent work has grown in scope, often encompassing elements of the thriller and playing out over multiple books. Indeed, her last 15 novels have been divided into trilogies connected by character, setting, and/or theme, and they've earned Wendy 3 nominations for the prestigious Mary Higgins Clark Award. It's a fitting distinction, given that Lisa Jackson once promised, "If you like Mary Higgins Clark, you'll love Wendy Corsi Staub." #truth. The Butcher's Daughter is the third and final book in Wendy's Foundlings trilogy, after Little Girl Lost and Dead Silence. The saga follows investigative genealogist Amelia Crenshaw as she attempts to solve the mysteries of her own past while helping clients such as NYPD Detective Stockton Barnes reconcile their own histories. Little do they know that somebody else is watching, somebody who has killed and will kill again to finish what her father started. Edgar Award winner Allison Galen called The Butcher's Daughter a twisting, turning, wholly absorbing thrill ride from one of my favorite writers, while Hallie Efron enthused an enthralling, thrilling, and above all satisfying ending to a superb trilogy. And I agree for what it's worth. Wendy Corsi Staub has long been one of the most dependable names in suspense fiction, delivering time and again, and always with a fresh twist. How does she do it? You're about to find out. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Central Booking. I am really excited to be in conversation with my good friend, Wendy Corsi Staub, today, who is the author of something like 90 books, and her newest is The Butcher's Daughter. It's the third book in her Foundling trilogy, which will be available on August 25th. Hey, Wendy, welcome to the show.
Hey, John. Nice to see you.
You as well. Really see you. It's amazing.
I know.
There
you are.
So I was thinking the other day when I was realizing that your episode was coming up that all of this that I've done probably I would not have done if it weren't for your influence. So for people who are like, man, we're so sick of him, they can blame you because had I not met you, I don't know if I would have done any of this fun book stuff.
That's so cool. Like, in what way? And how? I'm always so impressed with all you do, and I'm not going to take credit for it, but...
Lies. You were my first book signing, and you were like the first adult author that I ever met and got excited about. And we were able to sort of build a friendship. And
I remember that. You were so sweet, and you were so young. How young were you?
Now, not so sweet, not so young.
You're sweet and young still.
Loss of hair, filled out my face.
No, but I do remember that so well. I do remember meeting you because I was like, so cool that this young guy reads my books, because I have sons and they read, and it's like, yeah, guys read, and they read books by women.
Yeah, it was funny. I remember we met in Fairfield, and it used to be a Borders.
Yes, Craig Kennedy's Borders.
Yeah, Craig. And it was a Sunday afternoon, and I think it was The Final Victim had just come out, if I remember correctly. And you walked in, and I was just sort of sitting there, and you introduced yourself. But yeah, you had thought that I was just sort of like sitting there to sit there. You didn't actually think that I was there.
You were there for the event, and you were probably the only person.
No, it was a great event, and it worked out really well. But anyway, I don't know. And then I think you were like the first author to do my first little fledgling blog like a million years ago, and you were the first person I profiled for Mystery Scene when I started doing that. Then like all my little touchstones along the way.
And you have given so much back to me, like, just I always make sure like John's on the list for whatever we're doing, so I appreciate all the great word of mouth.
No, I appreciate it too. And I love, that one, you're so prolific, so there's always something to look forward to. And really your books for me are like coming home. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I love it because I always know that there's going to be a twist. It's going to be surprising, but there's going to be some familiarity too. And in times like these where there's so much uncertainty, it's really nice to have those things to look forward to. So you were like the gift that keeps giving, like 90 times, you know?
Made my day, John. Thank you. And it's morning, so
I know,
somebody
right? We
made
should
my day.
stop
Thank
right
you.
here, like end of interview.
Yeah, no wine today, people. Got coffee, got the iced tea.
Wine's
Unusual
for
for me.
we
People
would
say,
not want to deprive you. But anyway, so I mentioned that this new book, The Butcher's Daughter, is the conclusion of your most recent trilogy, which is called subtitled The Foundlings. So for people who might not know, can you really quickly tell us what a foundling is and how you were inspired by your own family tree for this idea?
yeah. So a foundling is basically a doorstep baby or an abandoned baby. It's a baby who doesn't know where, who grows up not to know where he or she came from. And my great-grandfather, my maternal great-grandfather, was a foundling. And I didn't know that while my mom was still alive, or even while my gram was still alive. It was her father, my grandmother's father. And turned out he was left on a doorstep in Sicily, where they lived back in the late 1800s. And he grew up, he came to America, had 13 children, but he was the redheaded, blue-eyed guy in their family, and he didn't match everybody else. And my grandmother had red hair and blue eyes. So it was interesting because, I didn't know all those years that he had been left on their doorstep, and they took him in and raised him. So I wanted to write, I set out to find out who he was. I did the DNA testing. I joined Ancestry. I sort of wanted to find out more about his past, and in the process I thought, what if, that's a great heroine, like someone who was left on a doorstep and then grows up she's an investigative genealogist, Amelia, my heroine, and she helps other people find out who they are because she hasn't found out who she is yet.
Right. Well, that was just the perfect segue because my next question was going to be about your heroine, Amelia. And I remember actually, you know, I don't know if I was moderating you or if I was just at a book signing with you when you would, you were promoting your newest book and you were talking about this idea that you were very excited about, which was, an investigative genealogist. And it seems like, always the best ideas come when you're entrenched in something else.
Something else, yeah.
Yeah, I remember thinking, wow, that's so, sort of rife for exploration. So can you talk a little bit about Amelia and what her journey is and how sort of trying to, figure out her roots opens up Pandora's box?
Oh, yeah. So necessarily this had to be set in the past because I the first book, this is a trilogy, right? So I just finished the trilogy, The Butcher's Daughter, which we're talking about because that's the new one coming out. That is set present day, but I had to build to that kind of. So the first book in the trilogy was called Little Girl Lost, and it opens in 1968 in New York City in Harlem, and a janitor in a church finds a baby left in a pew. And so it takes off from there. She grows up to be Amelia. Little Girl Lost, you meet her again when she's, I think she's 20 years old, about 20 years old. It's 1987 in New York. And so there are, history had to play a role in this, right? Like current events at the time. And I found it interesting that it was kind of mirrored as I brought the plot forward into present day in the next two books. The same issues are issues again. There were political issues, there were race issues, the civil rights movement now and then plays a huge role. Amelia's African American, and so is Barnes, Stockton Barnes, my hero cop from many books ago. He's been in many books, but he also has a child who he gave up years ago. So he's in this book too, and in all the books actually. So yeah, I'm sorry, John. I lost the thread of the original question because I got into talking about sort of the thread of Amelia's life and how we follow her till she's 50 years old, and she's still searching.
Right. No, not at all. That was actually great. I think you just ticked off like my next three questions, but
Sorry.
no, that's great. But yeah, you mentioned, can you talk a little bit about Detective Stockton Barnes too? Because Stockton, you have a lot of very loyal readers, and they are going to recognize him because he does tend to show up from book to book, and I don't think that was your initial plan, but he's become, such a likable but compelling and conflicted character, and here he is again.
Yeah, he appeared in my Monday's Landing trilogy that I did for Harper Willie Morrow. That was my last trilogy. I think he was even before that too. I think he popped up in a book before that. The Black Widow was where I
Right.
first introduced him. And he was supposed to be a throwaway character, like just this NYPD detective, missing persons detective. And then I loved writing about him, and my readers really liked him, and I kept bringing him back. And I didn't know he had a daughter. His partner Sully didn't know he had a daughter until the very end of my Monday's Landing, the last book, Bone White. So this trilogy picks up there, and I thought he's got to be on a collision course with Amelia, because she finds lost people and she puts them in touch with, she matches people with their biological roots. So he was the perfect foil sort of for her, and the perfect, I would say, hero of this trilogy, but a flawed hero. He's got some dark secrets.
And that's the thing too. People always debate likable, unlikable, redeemable, unredeemable. What's more important, a likable character or a believable character? And I would say believable,
Oh yeah.
sort of wins out for me. I mean, likable is nice, but we all have our flaws.
Oh
Not
yeah. And
maybe.
our villains have their likable points. I'm
Yeah.
not saying Stockton's a villain, but I'm just saying, like, nobody's all good and we're all bad. And I think for me to get into their heads, into characters' heads, I have to like find the good and bad in both, or it's not.
Oh,
You got to
sure.
find the good and the bad guy, and you got to make your hero flawed, or else it's just sickening.
Oh, I know, right? And for these kind of
Really
books too,
conflict.
it would not make, it wouldn't necessarily translate so well if everybody was just likable and loved each other and it was rainbows and butterflies.
No.
Just
I know, and Amelia has her flaws, and one of her flaws is that she's kind of obsessed with finding out who she is, and the people in her present day life are sort of like, let it go. Like, why are you, you haven't found out who you are, and she's just a dog with a bone with this. She just has to find out, and it hurts her personal life sometimes. So.
right. And actually, I wanted to ask you about that because there's sort of a counterpoint character to Amelia as well. She has a really good friend, Jessie, who is also a following, and they've sort of had really different experiences. And so they have sort of different philosophies about whether or not to pursue knowledge of their biological parents. So can you talk a little bit about their dynamic and how you're able to use that to represent sort of the differing philosophies when it comes to this issue?
Yeah, well, Jessie, so Jessie was found she lives in Ithaca now, and she's married to a police officer in the present day, and they're still very good friends. In Little Girl Lost, Amelia goes to Ithaca to meet a famous genealogist who works at Cornell University, and Jessie happens to live next door to him, and he became interested in this work because there was a family next door. Because you can't have, I hate coincidences that aren't founded in some kind of, they're not grounded. So Jessie is a fellow foundling, but she was raised in a very cohesive family, with loving parents and siblings. And I mean, she's complaining when we meet her she's 18 years old, and she has a lot of growing up to do. But Jessie has closure. She sort of decides she doesn't care because she's going to be good with whatever. Amelia didn't find out until her adopted mother, who she thought was her birth mother, was on her deathbed. She never found out that she was a foundling. So she has a lot of anger, and unresolved relationship with the parents who raised her. She felt like they did keep something from her. There's a very good reason, and we don't find out until The Butcher's Daughter. Like how
Right.
this all it's very complicated, and weaving it together was really rough.
But
There's a
imagine.
lot here. There's a lot here. It could have been 5 books probably, but
Yeah.
pretty complex storyline. So there's a reason, and she needs resolution to this. And so she and Jessie are coming at it from opposite places, but really, Jessie's the only person in her world who gets what it's like not to know, why you were left, or who you really are.
Right, right. And, talking about making those connections too, then in this book, well, actually, previously to this, Stockton Barnes actually, hires Amelia to track down his daughter, which is a fun and interesting twist and another way to raise the stakes. But I did want to ask you because obviously, it's a Wendy Corsi Staub book. So there are villainous people and murderous secrets. Um, so can you talk a little bit about the significance of this book's title, The Butcher's Daughter, and how it relates back to the Brooklyn Butcher that we learned so much about in the first book in this trilogy?
Yes, yeah, that's a great question too, because I love my title and I fought to keep this title because it works on a couple of levels and you only know that when you reach the end. But I can talk about, not to give things away, I can talk about the Brooklyn Butcher. He's my Charles Manson like cult killer in Little Girl Lost. So he, as that book is unfolding, or when Amelia is found, New York City is sort of in the grips of this. It's sort of based on that kind of Manson killers. Somebody was murdering families in Brooklyn and leaving the teenage daughters alive and pregnant, and so he was this heinous criminal. His name is Warren Matthews, and he has a daughter who grows up to become, her name is Gypsy Colt, and she plays a role in all three of these books, basically. So she's the Brooklyn Butcher's daughter. But it works on a couple of other levels, too, and I don't know how much I should give away.
Oh, that's funny, but it's such a provocative title. I love it. I'm glad they let you keep it.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you too. So you started out writing standalone novels, and you sort of progressed to either a couple connected books, and you've done trilogies, probably for the past decade or so. So how difficult is it to take a storyline and break it up into three books where it has to sort of stand alone for new readers, but also carry over for the people who have been with you for the entire journey from book one to book three? Because I would imagine that especially for a story like this, it has to be really difficult balancing your backstory with your narrative momentum.
Yes, yes. Thank you for recognizing that. This is my last trilogy for a while because it is very difficult. And when you write about ordinary people, which I tend to do, it's really rough to make it believable that, they're going to run into cold-blooded killers like three times, three books. So you have to have a really complex storyline where it makes sense that this would happen. The way that you link them, sometimes it's through character. I've linked through setting. Mundy's Landing was through setting. I've linked through theme. I did social media thrillers with trilogy before that. So this happened to be characters and Amelia as a genealogist. But it is really hard to remember what you wrote because you usually wrote it 3 years ago. As you're finishing book three, when you go back, you constantly have notes and, search and find is my best friend because I have to remember, and it can take a whole day to hunt down a certain detail in something that you wrote previously. It's just really hard to do. So yeah, you got to keep a lot of balls in the air. And I requested my Harper copy editor did all three books. She was so great because sometimes the copy editor is your only hope of catching inconsistencies, and she was fantastic. She had, she was great. So I thanked her in this book. And now her name's escaping me in this moment, but she's thanked in this book.
In the book. Yeah. For all time.
Yeah, I feel like I should look right now and thank her on air. She was wonderful. And my editor, of course, Lucia Macro, and my agent, Laura Peterson, those two have been there from the start. So they are key in helping me, just hammer out the plot and decide where this is supposed to go and what there's room for and what there's not room for. So I just rely so heavily and lean so heavily on them.
Sure. And so let me ask you this too. Even within the community, a lot of people sort of use the terms mystery and thriller interchangeably, even though there's, a difference between the two. And some people just say psychological suspense. So you're not really sure if you're getting a mystery or a thriller. And I think, over time, your books have just, you've evolved a lot and you've gotten, you take a lot of risks and a lot of chances. And I think that part of that is due to, you do have a really loyal readership and people want the same but different. And, figuring out what exactly that is must be very, very difficult.
Yeah, do the same thing, but do it completely differently.
I can't tell you what that is, but we'll know it when we read it, and then we'll
Yeah.
let you know, whether or not you nailed it. But for the longest time in your standalones, the big question was, who done it, and it was usually a familiar face that was wrapped up in sort of all this obscurity. And in more recent books, readers have actually gotten insights into who some of the bad characters are very early on, and then you follow them throughout the story. So can you talk about, one, how that sort of changes the dynamic of suspense? Because then it's not necessarily you're asking, who done it. It might be why done it, or, how or if you're going to be caught, and how that challenges you as an author, because I would assume that again is a very, intricate balancing act.
It is. And here, I feel like the great mystery here was sort of who Amelia's parents are, and those are the twists that come into play in this plot. And there are many twists in this. They're not, unmasking the villain in that sense, because my villain in The Butcher's Daughter, it's not a spoiler to say that Gypsy Colt is really truly a diabolical character but you meet her. So this takes place partly in the past. This takes place and unfolds in 1967, or is it 68? I can't remember. But so it does take place, and it circles right up to the moment where Little Girl Lost opened. The trilogy closes on that, in that exact moment, basically. So I show how this villain has evolved and sort of what shaped her. I love a female villain as much as I love a strong female, kick-ass female heroine. I think Amelia fulfills that, but so does Gypsy. I think she's not all bad, but boy, it was fun to write about her. So that's why in this, I was like, we know who the villain is, but the why of her situation was compelling to me.
Sure. And so I have to ask you too, and you already sort of touched on this book, but it does feel, or this element, but the book feels really timely, and as you said, there are a lot of, issues, social causes and social injustice that unfortunately seems to recur. And regardless of when you're writing about it, it still seems to be relevant or to resonate. But can you talk a little bit about, your research process? Because I know that you were a stickler for detail. And in this book, not only is it multiple timelines, different decades, but also, multiple geographical locations that you have to stay true to. And so, you go down the rabbit hole and you do all this research. So tell us a little bit about that. And then how do you know when it's time to sort of claw your way back out of the rabbit hole and start writing?
Yeah. So I start with the writing, and then I kind of know where I need to go with the research. And this is also necessarily set in, partially set in the Low Country. I love that part of the country. I've spent a lot of time in Savannah and on the in the South Carolina, Georgia coast, and just north of Jacksonville, there's an island called Amelia Island, and we spend, I've spent a week there every August until this year for probably, most of my kids' lives. So it's a beautiful part of the country, and Cumberland Island is just north of that. There's an old slave church there. It's a beautiful natural place, and then right up to Beaufort, South Carolina, and in Savannah. So St. Helena Island off of the coast of South Carolina has a Gullah community. And I spent a lot of time there. I we did a private tour with a descendant of the Gullah people. She told me so much, and it wasn't just finding the place and nailing the place, it was nailing who the people are, and without giving too much away. Amelia has ties to this area, and they will come to her attention, and she kind of winds up down there. And her name is not just a nod to my beautiful Amelia Island, but it's also, I better leave it at that without spoiling. Yeah, so I did spend a lot of time for each book. For each book, I made a separate research trip. I made actually a few trips. My son Morgan comes with me, and last year we spent a lot of time out in sort of the swamp land, and that comes into play in this book, which is I don't want to give anything away, but yeah, we spent a lot of time in those swamps.
You could tell, and it's great because it's very enveloping, and you create a very palpable sense of place. I should say places because there are so many of them, but it's really easy to immerse yourself in, which is always nice. I think especially now for people who are looking for escapism.
Yeah.
Um, it's funny when I look for escapism, I tend to go really dark. You would think, I'd be going for light and humor.
Yeah.
It's nice to see the worst of humanity in a fictional sense versus what we.
Exactly, versus the daily.
Yeah, yes. All right, so if you don't mind, I'm going to move to a couple more general questions, a little bit about your background and advice you might have or advice you might want to, take from Nora Roberts, because I know what you like to say. But first, let me ask you, how did your reading life influence your writing life? I know you don't like to talk about so much what you're reading now because you have so many friends, and heaven forbid, you name one and not another. But there were some people who were very, made an impression on you when you were young. So can you talk about the earliest memories that you have of books and how those influenced your thinking in terms of your career path and that third grade teacher?
And my third grade teacher, yeah. Well, my third grade teacher was the one, Mrs. Pizzolanti, who said that I was a good writer. And up on my office wall right behind me, I'm not going to try to maneuver my whole desktop, but I have a framed Abraham Lincoln essay that I wrote in third grade. And that was a moment for me when it was the first thing I ever wrote. Somebody told me I was good at it, and I loved to read already. And I went home from school and told my mom that I was going to be a writer. And my mom and dad said, go for it. You can do it. So that was when I decided what to do. And I never really changed my mind. When I was a kid, I loved to read mysteries. I loved Nancy Drew. I also loved like Laura Ingalls Wilder's series. I read everything. My family vacations were, I dragged my whole family in the car from New York State out to the Midwest, and we saw the house sites. I loved Mark Twain. We went to Hannibal, Missouri. I loved Louisa May Alcott. It was Massachusetts. So I liked historical stuff a lot back then, and I've woven a lot of that into my books. Mary Higgins Clark was the first adult author I had ever read. My friend Sue Pershone gave me her copy of Where Are the Children, and I devoured it. And later in my life, in my career, I had the opportunity to meet Mary many times, and I was nominated for the Mary Higgins Clark Award 3 times, and that's like a highlight of my career because she liked my books too. I got to, she just passed away, and she was such a gift to our industry. I mean, she was just gracious and wonderful and such a talented author with longevity. So.
Yeah, she was amazing. I mean, I was lucky enough to meet her a bunch of times, and like you said, so gracious. There, she'd be signing books for 500 people, and she would make you feel like you were the one.
She's the one, and she wasn't tired, and yeah, she remembered people. It was amazing.
Yeah, she was amazing, and it's funny that you mentioned her because she too was sort of my first adult, suspense author. I went from like Nancy Drew to Mary Higgins Clark.
Do you remember which one of hers?
It was, oh my gosh, it was. I want to say Moonlight Becomes You. It was a little bit later of like the mid-90s books, and then like The Lottery Winner.
Yeah. Or what's her name? The woman.
Elvira.
Elvira, yeah, and her husband, the Valeri.
Favorite character. She was great.
Right.
But yeah, so of course you read that, and then you go back and read all the others. But I have to say that if it weren't for Mary Higgins Clark, I might not have discovered your books because I still remember the day I picked up your first book. Well, your first book that I read. It wasn't my first book, but it was All the Way Home, which had a really, really cool Gothic cover, very dark, with this house and this wrought iron fence, and I think a scarf or something on the fence, a little red scarf or some kind of piece of cloth. But on the front of it, there was a quote, I think from Lisa Jackson, that said, "If you like Mary Higgins Clark, you'll love Wendy Corsi Staub," and it's true. But
thank you for saying that, because that quote has got a lot of mileage. I think Lisa's a friend of mine, and I'm always grateful for that quote. I've since met her as well. She's somebody that, but I'm so grateful, but I think she's kind of like, hang it up now. It's been 20 years, 25 years. My publishers love to use that one because Mary has legs, and it's an honor to be compared. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and it's very true. And I remember, that was like the selling point. I'm like, all right, this book sounds great. The cover's good. I like authors with three names, obviously, and they're American Mary Clark. And the funny thing is, I remembered, all right, I'll give this a try. And as I was walking out, it was a Barnes and Noble, and they used to have like books right up front, new releases, and you had a new one out, and it was the one about the babysitter. I can't remember the title right now, but it was about
Yeah,
the
in order right up there. Yeah, I'm
baby.
trying to remember.
And I'm like, oh, should I get it? And stupidly, I was like, no, let me read this one first. And I read it so quickly that I was literally there that weekend to pick up the next book, and
So
everything else was
nice.
bad. But
Thank you.
coming back to Mary James Clark, but actually, let me ask you about that, because a comparison that I could make, and that I'm sure other people have made between your books and hers, is that they are very suspenseful and dark things happen, but there's nothing really gratuitous. Most of the violence is off the page. There's not a lot of bad language or sex. So can you talk, a little bit about your approach to suspense and the psychological aspect, because you really allow readers to build a lot of that for themselves?
Yeah, to me that's more powerful. I just kind of, well, and also I started out writing YA suspense, young adult suspense, so I didn't realize my first adult suspense novel does have graphic violence and language, and I just felt like that was what I needed to do for the adult market. And then one of my teen readers showed up at my book signing, and I was like, oh, this doesn't really work for me, because she's like, I loved it. Boy, and I was kind of like, and then my grandmother and my mother were reading it. I just kind of felt like, and I was young at the time. I mean, it's very early in my career. I was in my mid-20s. And so I thought, I don't think I need to go there for the next one. And I didn't. I found out that it was much more satisfying for me. I don't have a problem with it.
Right.
It's just more satisfying for me to sort of let a lot of the graphic stuff happen off camera. Partly because I just can't bear, those are the things I can't bear. Like if we're watching a movie, I have to be like, tell my husband, like, I'll be in the kitchen. I run out of the room, like, call me when I can come back. I can, so I'm a baby.
Oh, I totally get it. And I'm that person in the theater, like at the horror movie, who's laughing when
Oh, okay,
everybody
so
else
you're,
is horrified.
you're brave. I'm like, you know.
Yep. Well, we're the two opposite ends of that spectrum. But no, I can really appreciate both. And I think it really depends on what you're in the mood for. But I did, want to get back to your roots as a writer, because you mentioned, you knew very early, third grade, you were told that you had a talent, and you really believed in that, and you cultivated that, and you took some very concrete steps,
Yeah.
later in life to make that a reality. So can you talk about, your move to New York and working in the industry, and how that sort of helped you along your path?
Yeah. I mean, I wrote all the way through high school. I was like newspaper editor, that kind of thing. And I just I thought writers lived in New York, because that just seemed right to me. And I didn't think you needed to go to college to learn how to write. My parents said, no, you will go to college for 4 years and then you can do whatever you want. So they really forced me, thank God, because I learned craft. I had a lot of growing up to do. I wouldn't trade my college years. I went to Fredonia, SUNY Fredonia. Wouldn't trade that for anything. I did learn how to accept criticism because I was in writers' workshops, and it was great experience. At that time I worked in a bookstore. I worked at the Book Nook in my hometown, little indie bookstore, and it was a great education in what makes readers pick up books. And I did that deliberately because I wanted to be immersed, any place where I could be surrounded by books and reading. And from there, it just made sense to go to New York and get a job in publishing, because I had to support myself somehow. So I worked in publishing. I was an editor. I was a freelancer. I was also a telemarketer. I was also, I did everything I could to pay the bills. But I did have a day job, and I used to write freelance copy, like covers for books. I was a freelance reader for Red Book magazine. Like, I did a lot of work behind the scenes in publishing, and it helped me learn the industry.
Sure, and I have to ask you too. I know that, some people who've followed a similar path and really immersed themselves in the industry have found that it can be, both a help and a hindrance, because on the one hand, you understand the business much better, and then on the other hand, you understand the business much better, and you
Yeah.
realize, your chances of success,
Yeah.
might not be what they seem. But I did say that I was going to, ask you about the advice that you would give to other writers. And I know that in your early editing days, I believe you got to work with Nora Roberts before she became the Nora Roberts that we all know.
Yeah, I did.
Um,
So-
and
so
often
far.
you reference her advice. So would you mind sharing that with?
Yeah, she's often said, ass in the chair. When people say, how do you get your work done? How do you write so many books? There's no other way to get it done. And I'm a firm believer in that. There are so many things I'd rather be doing most days than sitting in this chair writing for, 14 hours a day or whatever it is. But there's only one way to get words on paper, and people will come to me and say, I have a great idea for a book, you should write it. It's like, no, the ideas are never the problem. I have plenty of ideas. I will never have enough time in my life to write all of the ideas I have. So you need to sit down and write your ideas. It's very simple, really, in the end, and people are often looking for a way to, I don't see how you can write a book. It's just, it's a lot of sitting down and boring work.
Gonna say, yeah, nothing happens, without sitting down in the chair. And, that touches because I feel the same way. I have a lot of ideas. I don't, commit any of them to paper. And I'll be like, but Chelsea, I have so many ideas. And she'll say, well, pick one.
I know.
It really is that simple.
And that is where the work ethic comes in that I did learn in publishing, because I would see as an editor that, I would buy somebody's first book and it would come out and be a huge success, and readers want more immediately. Like you said, when you read that first one, you bought the next one. So the authors who were the most successful were the authors who would send me that first book and immediately be working on the next and have another one published right away. And that's the only way to sustain a career, I think, for all these years and through all of these changes in the industry. That has sustained me, just being prolific,
Right.
And sort of not doing all the fun things that you want to do when your deadline's waiting.
Sure. And I have to ask you too, people always ask about work-life balance, and obviously that can be a tricky thing, especially, when you're a book a year author or a multi-book a year author, and you have been both. But can you talk a little bit about, your family and how you sort of made it a family business, because you do a lot together, and that way you sort of get to incorporate the business and the pleasure. And I think that that's a really, terrific thing.
It is, yeah. So when I have two sons, now they're 22 and 25, they're old, and they're locked down with us through this pandemic. So it's kind of a gift for me, not so much for them, but one's working from home, one just graduated college. So yeah, now they're old, but when they were little boys, for me, part of the motivation to be so prolific was to be able to stay home with them, because I had office jobs, and I thought we lost both of our moms young, my husband's mom and my mom, and I didn't have the ability to have family like right there. We lived far away from everybody too. So it was kind of us. It was my husband and I was like, one of us should be with these boys and get them through these terrible losses too. So that was part of my motivation. And then we always said, because my husband's job was very demanding, he was commuting to Manhattan, he worked in advertising. We always said if we could make up his salary with mine, that he would take some time off to be home with the boys, because he never saw them. He left in the morning before they were up, and he was home at night way after they went to bed. So the day I made the New York Times bestseller list, we decided that would be, his motivating factor to take a leave of absence. So he did leave his job a few months later, and for about 10 years, he was home with the boys. I was able to start traveling and doing book events, and in the summers we set out to do a 50-state book tour, and we would travel for a month every summer with the boys till they got old enough to have jobs and not want to be with us. But it was really great because they helped with brainstorming. They spent a lot of time in bookstores as I was signing. We did research trips where they were very key. It was just a great way to spend those years, and I wouldn't give them up for anything. My husband's back at work now, but they're old enough, the boys, that now they, one was an English major, and he's such a good writer. He won his college's, I'm bragging now, writing award. And the other one, my younger son and I wrote a couple of scripts together, and one has made it quite far in an encouraging process. We're hoping to see some progress with that. So they're both writers in their own right, and they're creative people. And I think that being on the front lines for all of this in part because we needed to drag them to all of these places, but it also made them curious and creative, and we were able to spend all that time together. So.
Sure. Yeah, it's funny you would say that because I can't believe your kids are in their 20s. Like, I remember, being
You
at a
were
book
rolling
event.
around on the floor at the book
Yeah,
signings, right?
yeah, like the old Borders, the event space was upstairs, and that was also the
Yeah.
kids' space, and they had, games and stuff, and your kids would just run off and do their thing, and now
Yeah.
they're
Now they're adults. I used to plant them in the audience with questions too. I'd be like, now if no one asks mommy a question, so my little 6-year-old would be like, where do you get your ideas?
Okay, I have like 2 more questions for you.
Okay.
But one, I want to ask you, it sort of ties in with this, familial bond. But I told you before we started recording that I was talking to Allison Galen, your good friend, earlier in the week. And, I was asking her about how, parenthood or motherhood, how you're able to sort of draw upon those fears and insecurities and work them into your books. And because her story, her daughter's an adult now. And so her newest story is about, a very young child that goes missing. So she seems to like to put a little distance, between her own children and what she's writing about. And you, on the other hand, you have said in the past that you tend to write about the things that scare you. And if you put them in a book, the hope is that they won't happen in real life. And then we laughed because, then we said, well, she's written 90 books. So
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Covering all my bases.
I know you're doing very well. What a good reason to be prolific. But can you talk a little bit about how you are able to draw on the experience, of parenthood and the fears and insecurities that come along with that to sort of be emotional resonance in your novels?
Yeah. I wrote The Last to Know. That's about, that was one of the domestic suspense novels I wrote early on in my career when they put that first baby in my arms, my son, I realized I would die for him. I would do anything to keep this kid alive. It's now for the rest of my life, my responsibility, my vocation. And I think that it speaks to the characters that I write about, because my theory is everybody has something that they would lie for and die for probably and kill to protect. And I like to find that, even the most ordinary person, I like to find that thing and then threaten it and see, how far would you go to protect the things and the people that you love? And also there's nothing scarier than thinking you can protect yourself. You're doing what you should be doing every day. You're living in this safe little town and you lock your doors and then somehow danger finds you. That's the scariest thing I could think of. Hey, John. Thanks for interviewing me at Central Booking. I am really looking forward to seeing you in person again one of these days. And until we do, it was great talking to you. And I am just going to give you a little scoop about what I'm working on next. I am writing a 4th book in the Lilydale Mystery Series, and it'll be out sometime next year. I am, about a quarter of the way through it, and it's a lot of fun to revisit Bella and Pandora and Odelia and Jiffy and Max and the whole gang, especially Chance the cat. So that's one scoop, and the other is I'm working on a standalone single title thriller, and it's called The Watcher, and you heard it here first. So I don't know if the title will stick, but you heard it here first. It's coming out probably sometime next year. Thanks. Bye.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.